So continuing chapter 9, we're going to take a bunch of the stuff that we've kind of built up through the course of this semester and use it to explain some very basic biological theories. In this, Dirk brings his family tree to class. Way back when, just single-celled, the Jorgensens, Hilda and Ned, the Olsons, Betty and Irv, Grandma Ross, Grandpa Bob, this guy was sucked into a tar pit. Uncle Andy had a tail, Dad and Mom, me, my sister. Here's the thing. Human beings, we got to explain stuff, right? We got to name stuff. We got to figure out what's related to what. We got to look around us and go, where did all this come from? Where'd you come from? Where'd that come from? Why? And for a very, very long time of human history, we were working on a very limited set of knowledge. What did Grandpa know? What did Great-Grandpa know? What did Great-Great-Grandpa know? Stuff comes down, but it was coming down through what they call oral tradition. And as far as oral tradition could go back to, the world was always the way the world was. Is that the world around you, yeah, it changes a little bit. Maybe some stuff happens, but basically it was all pretty much this. So any kind of explanation for where everything came from had to explain where this came from as it is. And so your older explanations for the origins of the world all amounted to poof, because you needed it kind of fully formed at the beginning to explain what we knew of the past, because the past was not so distant. And then folks discovered fossils and figured, okay, I guess things have been around for a while. Where are these guys? Look at this big bone. You seen anything that's got a bone like this? No, I've never seen anything got a bone like this. Well, they must have lived around here. Maybe great-great-great-great-grandparents ate them all or drove them away. And that gave rise to the idea of not just dragons, these giant monstrous creatures, but the expectation that as we expanded beyond the edge of the map, here there be dragons. Because we figured they're still living somewhere, because the world is as the world is. It doesn't change all that much over time. And we talked about the history of evolution and how people started to figure out how the fossils had formed. And eventually, as we expanded across the whole world, we started to realize, no, there not be dragons over the edge. Is that you go far enough and you meet the other edge coming the other way. And so things have not always been the same, which expanded a whole new era of, so where did this all come from? There haven't always been people. There haven't even always been dinosaurs. So if we go back and back and back and back, where did it all come from? And that's what we're going to deal with here. Now, as far as the poof, there it is explanation, a lot of people think that scientists are anti-religion because we kind of don't like those. Well, the thing is, remember, science is all about, well, how do you test that? And poof is not a testable hypothesis. No time machines. And there's even a semi-scientific explanation that is sort of kind of testable, but nobody really likes, called Panspermia. The idea of Panspermia is that the very first life on Earth didn't come from Earth. It came from somewhere else. Is that some people have taken meteorites and sterilized them in the lab and cracked them open and found viable bacterial spores, which means they came from somewhere else. Well, nobody's ever convinced that they've actually done the sterilization properly. Meteorites are incredibly porous things, and they've come in and whacked into the soil. And So that's a hard test to really convince people of. And more so, if it came from somewhere else, then your next question is, so how did it start there? And it's like, we don't know. Well, what good are you then? Is that let's come up with explanations for how life started here. And that's what we're going to talk about. And I'll talk about things that there are evidence for and things that are, we don't really know how this works yet. We just kind of assume it must work this way. As people started to think seriously about where life originated, they ran into what's known as the plant problem. Uniformitarianism. Yeah. We understand the past by kind of applying how things work now to processes in the past. And we looked around the life as we knew it and went, well, everything that's alive is working off of photosynthesis as producers. This was before anybody knew anything about chemosynthesis. And so the plants supply the food for the whole food chain. So in order for life to have originated in the distant past, the first thing you needed was plants. And we haven't even gotten to photosynthesis yet. Photosynthesis is a very complex operation. Just having it kind of fall together was not a viable explanation anybody would trust. So it was the plant problem. If plants had to be the first step, we can't figure out how that happened. And then discoveries were made. As light comes through space dust, certain frequencies get absorbed, play with the molecules, and then come back out at another frequency. And you can read the frequencies of the light on this side of the dust clouds and figure out what the materials in the clouds are. And a bunch of rock, a bunch of water, organic molecules. That surprised people. There are, fairly simple, but honest to goodness organic molecules flying around in space, which means that the materials that formed the Earth at the very beginning, as the Earth coalesced from rocks and water and organic molecules, the rocks would have settled by gravity and formed the hard part of the Earth. The lighter stuff would have been on the outside, the water and the organics and the gases in the atmosphere, and produce what people started to call the very first organic juice, the primordial soup. Why do you need plants? Because plants can produce complex organic molecules that can be pulled apart for energy. Well, what if the original oceans were full of this stuff anyway, because it's part of the dust of the galaxy? And so you don't need plants. You just need molecules pulling other molecules apart for energy, and then assembling molecules using the energy. So the first primordial soup oceans would have been full of organic molecules. And they wouldn't have been alive, but they would have needed certain life abilities. These are from the list we did in the very first chapter. And these are all things that molecules, collections of molecules can do. They can construct themselves. They can organize themselves using raw materials from the soup around them. They can use sources of energy. There was energy available in the environment. Heat, remember, heat's a pretty good one. Certain types of ultraviolet radiation, no oxygen, no ozone layer. So a lot of radiation would have hit the ocean and fiddled in the upper layers because it wouldn't have penetrated very far. So it might have been usable there. Heat would have been a really big one. The Earth would have been a very warm place. It had just cooled enough to have oceans, for goodness sake. And in order to get deeply into the future, they needed to be able to make more of themselves, and they needed to be able to change over time. And we'll come back to this in a little bit, but that's what you kind of need at the beginning. They're not life as we know it, but they're life adjacent. They're on their way. What do we need to get to life? I'm putting this down in the wrong order. Well, eventually you need cells. And remember, all life on Earth uses a protein-based chemistry, but DNA coding to produce the proteins. Now, that's a very tricky step, but it would have been a very late step after molecular evolution. He's looking at the bowl going, primordial soup again? So the steps laid out here: abiotic synthesis, making things that are not truly alive yet, but being able to take compounds and organize them into strands, polymers, and then being able to make copies, and eventually being able to package the copies. So people go, well, what are the odds for this? And you know, the odds are not great. But we're talking about a planet forming about 4.5 billion years ago, starting with a primordial soup pretty quickly. The oldest fossils that we can call prokaryotic fossils are 1 billion years later. So these would be cells, but 1 billion years, actually it's less than that now. This is a fairly old overhead. But what are the odds? You got a whole doggone planet covered with this stuff. You've got available energy at a higher level, more heat than would be available now. So yeah, the odds are pretty lousy, but keep in mind the odds for hitting the lottery are pretty good if you buy 1 million lottery tickets. And there was a lot of stuff going on planet-wide for hundreds of millions of years to get you from a bunch of molecules bopping around to organizations that start to look like what modern molecules in cells are. Couple of things. The current leading theory is that the first organized pre-life molecules were RNA. It's a polymer, and RNA in some conditions can act like proteins. There are RNA enzymes that actually make chemistry work. It can make copies of itself, and the idea that you could start with RNA, have some RNA that codes for proteins, right? That's how proteins get made, different RNAs working together. And have some RNAs that can back produce a double strand that's more stable and is your good storage molecule. So it's like RNA to DNA and to protein synthesis is, that's the explanation right now. Can we do this in a lab? Are there tests where we can get RNA to back produce DNA or have it spontaneously start to produce proteins? No. It's not even that easy to simulate in a computer, but it's the best explanation anybody has. So science is not that great at figuring out these early steps either. We kind of like this because people keep coming up with stuff that we can test. bits and pieces. And we're hoping that eventually we'll pull it all together into a big explanation. But right now, there are huge holes in the explanation. But here's some of the evidence. We no longer are depending on light coming from dust to tell us what sort of materials was in primordial soup. It's still here. There's still primordial soup trapped under the crust of the earth, and it bubbles up in those hydrothermal vents. It supplies a lot of the raw materials for chemosynthesis. And chemosynthesis tells us that production of food molecules can happen without having to be plants. Also, if you look at the outer solar system, there's still a bunch of primordial soup out there. Is that there are whole moons that are covered with this stuff. There are asteroids that are coated with these organic materials. Comets have these organic materials in them. So there's a lot of stuff close to home that shows us really what the primordial soup was made from and how to cook it up. And we know more about how the Earth originally was in terms of atmosphere and tides and a bunch of other stuff that would have influenced things. One of the things we know is that part of the organic materials are very oily, lipidy-like materials. So it wouldn't have just been a primordial soup. It would have been a scummy primordial soup covered with this light, floaty, lipidy material. But also lots of weather, lots of ability to drive this stuff under the surface and have it form bubbles. And at some point, well in, if some of these molecular organizations, and the first molecules would have probably been fairly organized and cooperative, because that's what happens in a cell too. Ones that could pull a bubble around them and stabilize it and keep it under the surface, because up on the surface it would flow onto the surface again. That's the very beginning of cells, a protocell, an isolated, and remember, isolation is a great thing to keep your chemistry going. So this is something that you can do. The RNA stuff we can't do, but the protocell stuff we can kind of sort of simulate. But what we're moving toward is the first things we would recognize as life would have been prokaryotes. And they would have been prokaryotes for a really, 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 really long time. And all of it, producers, consumers, decomposers, chemosynthesis, photosynthesis, aerobic respiration, eventually. We actually have a pretty good idea for when photosynthesis really caught on. One of the big issues, though, was, okay, how do you get from this to this? How do you get from using heat to using light? And there, a clue came from these hydrothermal vents, these cracks on the bottom of the ocean floor where chemosynthesis happens, where scientists go down and they take a bunch of specimens, because there's really weird things that live down there. And one day, I'm making sort of this story up, but it's a basic story. Two scientists are sorting through their samples, and they're looking at these crabs, and they're looking at the cephalopods, and then one of the guy goes, it's got eyes. The other guy goes, yeah, this one I got has got eyes too. And the first guy goes, you've been down there, right? If we don't have the lights on, it's pretty doggone dark down there. The light doesn't come down from the surface. What are they using the eyes for? You go, well, maybe stuff, maybe there's glowing stuff. I don't know. We know that some of the deep water fish glow stuff. Maybe there's stuff on the bottom. Okay, let's check next time we go down. They settle on the bottom. I can't imagine settling in this little submarine a mile under the water and then turning all your lights off. But they did that. They settled next to the hydrothermal vents. They turned off the lights, and it wasn't animals glowing. The vents themselves glow. But they're hydrothermal vents. There's a lot of heat and turbulence as the water mixes, and if you get in the wrong place at the wrong time, you get picked up and you get swept away. Well, anything away from the hydrothermal vents, the ecosystem peters out and there's nothing. These are like an oasis at the bottom of the ocean. So if you're from there and you get swept away, you better be able to find your way back. That's why they have eyes. And somebody went, okay, how do we get from chemosynthesis to photosynthesis? What do we need to get to this? Well, we need some light processing. Well, you know what seeing light is? It's light processing. So they think that the combination of chemosynthesis and light processing got eventually to a simple type of photosynthesis, to a more complex photosynthesis, to the production of oxygen, which there's a point in the very, very distant fossil layers where it's all rust, where the oxygen released by many, many photosynthetic prokaryotes oxidized the iron in the water, produced rust, which doesn't dissolve and settle down to the bottom. Is that there's a picture in the book of these layers and layers and layers of rusty sediments from the sedimentary rock layers of very, very long ago. But this was the world for at least 1 billion years, the prokaryote world. I mean, it still is to a large extent. And then eventually we get to eukaryotes, but I'm going to pick that up on the next video.